Hello. Hope everybody's doing okay out there. Here I am once again, somewhere in the bunker. I've moved locations again, although in the back you can see one of my wing chairs. I think one of the ones I did the first lecture in. What to say? Well, a few announcements. Most of these will also be repeated by email. I'm recording this on Wednesday, and this will actually go up tomorrow, Thursday. More about that in a moment. In terms of life in the RVA, for those of you who don't live in the Dominion of Virginia, you may or may not have heard that earlier in the week, Governor Northam basically, by an executive act, ordered everybody to stay home, which doesn't really change my life much because my wife and I have been staying home largely anyway, because we thought it was a good idea, but now it's been given official sanction. And for us, this is supposed to run at least into about the second week of June. Which is not happy making, obviously, for anybody, but it's probably warranted under the circumstances. For those of you who don't know much about politics in Virginia, actually, Governor Northam is a physician. He's I think he does some sort of pediatric medicine, so he knows somewhat of what he speaks. And so this is the sort of situation we have here now, where you're at. Maybe something somewhere is going on. In terms of specific announcements, about the course, I have a few, and like I said, all of these will be repeated to you via email. There will be a Braveheart discussion board going up tomorrow morning, Thursday, the 2nd of April at around 8 o'clock, and I'll let that run completely through the weekend. Have some fun with it. You know my attitude toward these movies. I view them first as entertainments, and you can certainly comment on the film on that level, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. We can also talk about it in reference to its portrayal of specific historical events. And as I told you, once we've done all our discussion and stuff, I'll tape another little video and send to you where I give you some of my impressions of it, actually running in both directions as just an entertainment and also as a depiction of a specific place and time and the events therein. So that'll be going up soon. And I should note, in terms of the discussion board for Jocelyn, a fair number of you got involved in it, and you all did a very nice job. I would love to see more of you to get into the game on this, and Braveheart would be a really easy entree to it, and so keep that in mind. I'll remind you about it. In terms of Blackboard, the entire Blackboard reader is now up and running. I finally got around to posting everything, and so if you're one of these people who like to read ahead, the stuff's there and it's available for you. I should note that before you listen to this lecture, you should go to Blackboard also and print the outline for the lecture so that you can follow along. This is kind of a long one, and so I should note, since it is so long, this is one you might definitely want to break up into parts. Maybe listen to country first and then move to town or something like that. In addition to the outline for the lecture, there will be some outlines in regard to a village called Cressingham and another one called Alwalton. You should print those two because I'm going to talk about them a bit in the lecture, and that will give you something to refer to when these things come up. There will also be a study guide going up dealing with the topic generally and also more specifically with the materials on the Blackboard reader. And for this topic, there's quite a bit, actually. It's the densest in terms of amount of reading, except perhaps for the women topic, where you get to read a fair amount of the book of Marjorie Kemp, and so you might want to get into it. There will also be a discussion board placed up for Town and Country, and that'll probably go live sometime early next week. I should also note, I don't know what you'll make of this, but there is some potential for some cosplay by me on a couple of the remaining lectures. Let me know if you like something like that, if you'd enjoy it. In terms of other official business, most all the prospectuses are in. I'll get to those very, very soon to get them back to you. I'm making progress on the midterms, and I'll try to get those back to you sooner rather than later. One thing that has happened with a lot of faculty members because of the disruption of life, people have had somewhat of an amotivational syndrome problem in reference to grading. It's not just me, it's been a lot of people, but I'm getting through the midterms, and I'll get those back to you so you know precisely where you stand in the course. And that's pretty much it as far as the announcements go. And so what we're going to take up today is this topic called Town and Country. And as I look back at my lecture on it, I realize probably a better formulation would be country and town, since that's the order that we do them in. But Town and Country sounds better because of the magazine. And so that's the title I gave to the lecture. In terms of the topic itself, through this point in the semester, the history has been discussed largely of a masculine elite. It's a very dominated course early on because of the type of topics that you're talking about. And this masculine elite was no more than 5 to 10% of the population, even if that. We've left most of the rest of society aside up to this point. For the next several topics, we're going to shift the focus to the masses and to women, to the other parts of society that we haven't spoken about much. And we should note that when you talk about these groups, there is a bit of a problem with voice. And what I mean by that is that these groups of people, particularly the peasantry that we'll talk about quite a bit, these people rarely spoke for themselves. We know about them through what is said about them by other people, things written by this other more elite group. And so you always have this problem of trying to get at what they actually thought. You can often know what they did, but their own thoughts, particularly for the peasantry, they're somewhat of a mystery to us. It's one of those really hard problems with pre-modern history where literacy rates are low and where people didn't get the opportunity in most instances to record their thoughts. And I'll talk about this in various other contexts as we move on for the remainder of the semester. And so you do have this problem that this elite that we've talked about for most of the semester, they provide the information regarding the rest of society. So everything is placed through their filter to some degree. And so, take that for what it's worth. And as you probably gathered or will gather, as we move into this portion of the course, it's the part of the course with which I have the most personal interest. Some of these topics are very personal to me. Actually, the monasticism topic was as well, for reasons which may or may not become clear as we move on. But as you move later into English history and as you move away from political and military history, these other aspects of it are things that I have a very more of a personal stake in, and it may be reflected to some degree in the way I present things and the topics that I talk about. Before we get into the topic proper, we should give you a little bit of a prologue. And the prologue that in the lecture I title it Political and Military Authority Meets Seigneurial Authority. Political and military is pretty clear. Seigneurial is probably less clear, but we'll try to clarify what that is. Basically, up to this point in the semester, when you're talking about the aristocracy, the nobility in Europe, the movers and shakers, these people involved in all these big events that we discussed from the Norman conquest onward, these people amongst themselves are in what you would categorize as honorable relationships. That there's a hierarchy, obviously, politically and militarily, but if you're part of that hierarchy, you are a free person, and that it doesn't reflect badly on you. It does not stigmatize you to be a subordinate within that hierarchy. Basically, they're all free. Some are more powerful than others, some are wealthier than others, but they are all considered to be honorable people. Then there are dishonorable relationships where there is a stigma attached to you being at the bottom end of that relationship. And this is the sort of relationship most people had with the aristocracy, the nobility. These were the people who were outside of those groups, but they have relationships with people in these groups, and they are subordinate, but in a very negative way, in the way these things are understood within society. And so, in terms of these two types of relationships, the honorable political military relationship and the less honorable seigneurial relationship, and that's where that term comes from, the thing that brought them together, the nexus between them, was land, basically, for both types of lordship, both for this political military lordship and for this seigneurial lordship, where you have a lord associated with the peasantry in most instances. Land equaled power, essentially. Land also equaled material support. If you were going to engage in certain types of occupations, you had to free yourself from labor. And if you had enough land, you could do that. And so this is sort of how these things work and how these two types of lordship come together. Land was inextricably bound with the people who lived and toiled on it. And basically, it's the lordship over land and over laborers, over people working the land, that freed the nobility and the church to perform their functions. And so this leads us into sort of a very common conception of medieval social order. Some of you may have already encountered this in other courses, in other contexts. But within the medieval mind, there was a conception of a tripartite social order. You had three types of people, basically. You had the bellatores, the oratores, and the laboratores. The bellatores were those who fought. The oratores were those who prayed, and the laboratores were those who worked. And the notion is that these three orders sort of worked in concert, that each did something for the other two. Obviously, in the case of the bellatores, they provided order for the church to do its work, and they protected the laboratores, the workers. And so that's their function in it. Basically, the oratores helped both groups of the other two groups get into heaven. So that was their function. And the laboratores provide the material wherewithal where the other two groups could do their work. And so it's notion that these groups are bound, but everybody would be in an order. And the assumption in most instances is that you would be born into that segment of the order, and you would tend to stay there, with rare exceptions. And so when they think about the social order, they think about it as being a divinely ordained static order. And so up to this point, we've been talking about the prayers and the fighters. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the workers. And we should note, you've already encountered actually this intersection of land as the nexus for drawing everything together. When you think about Abbot Sampson in Jocelyn's Chronicle, one of his big concerns all the time, actually an obsessive concern, was the landed property held by the abbey and the proper management of it, because it was that wealth that allowed the house to exist and to perform its function within society. And as you know, in monastic life, the notion is that these people are there to pray, to improve in their own spirituality, but the assumption also was that their prayer helped the entirety of society. And so to perform their function, they needed to be freed from other obligations, and this was done through these landed endowments. And in terms of understanding the way land was understood by these people at the time, particularly in the post-conquest period, we should again refer back to, as we do many times, the Domesday Book, which was produced in 1086. As you already know, this document, this survey, this inquest that William the Conqueror had commissioned. Basically, if you look at Domesday Book, and you've encountered an excerpt or two from it already. There's an excerpt or two of it in the Blackboard Reader dealing with specific places. What Domesday Book is the survey of all the lands in England, who held them and what they held. And if you read Domesday Book in its original Latin, you will run across the word manorium, literally not just hundreds, but thousands of times. When the Normans came to England and they decided to survey what was there and what property they held, this was a conception they brought over with them, this conception of the manorium, what we would call the manor. And they saw manors everywhere. And as the survey was being done, it was done on the basis of these manors and who held them. It's a generic label applied by the Normans to the circumstances that they encountered on the ground. And so that's where we get the word manor and the word manorialism to describe this system and this type of lordship, this other type of lordship, this thing that's dishonorable to the peasants who were involved in it. Basically, the manor functioned as the sinews of the army because these manors produced the material wherewithal that allow people to engage in military political occupations. The manor was also the sinews of medieval society because it fed everybody. It provided whatever material support everybody within society got. Everybody depended upon the production agriculturally of these manors to live. Everybody's got to eat. And if you want something beyond just eating, it's this agriculture that would help you produce enough of a surplus to devote resources to something else and acquiring something else. And so it's fundamental to our understanding of arrangements in the Middle Ages. And if you think about it in the broadest sense, what these manors provided was the material basis for the medieval cultural, intellectual, and institutional achievements. When we talk about the High Middle Ages, the period from around 1000 to 1300, as I've noted before, it represents the zenith of the medieval achievement. When you think about the Middle Ages, most people think about the cathedrals, they think about the castles. Uh, they think about other institutions that are produced during this time. They think about intellectual achievements, writers like Aquinas and Robert Grosseteste, these famous theologians, uh, Abelard, all those people. When you think about those achievements, and I always point this out to people, as you travel in Europe, as you see the towns that are the medieval portions of the towns, as you see the cathedrals, as you see the castles, always bear in mind that the resources necessary to have those things emanated mostly from the ground, from people working and giving up some of their surplus to support these other large projects. Without this sort of economic system that you had, this manorial system, that existed on the ground, you would have not had the resources to devote to these other things and to free other people to do other occupations that were non-agricultural. We live in this world now where nobody intends to be farmers for the most part. We'd already talked about this in class a little bit, that we don't feed ourselves for the most part. We go to the grocery store, although at this point I think most of us, considering what's going on, wouldn't have minded having had a garden put into our backyard so we wouldn't have to go out so much. But the point here is that when you see all of these things, they had to come from somewhere, and this is where they came from. Now, in terms of the period that we're talking about, the specifics of what I'm going to discuss here reflect conditions from around 1000 to 1300, again, during the High Middle Ages. They continue into the Late Middle Ages, but there's some things that begin to happen in the 14th and 15th centuries that begin to alter the arrangements, and we'll get to that as we move further into the course. And so you have this era of the High Middle Ages where you have sustained economic growth. That's one of its large characteristics. It's that economic growth that allowed the growth in all of these other areas that we've talked about in other contexts this semester. So let's first go to where it starts, in the countryside. We're going to talk about manners and manorialism here. But I should note, when we talk about the manor, the Normans called anything that sort of fit their notion of in a manor. What you'll discover is that when you look at individual villages, manors basically, there's an infinite number of patterns. There's no single situation. Each village is unique. Each manor is unique to some degree. You'll see manors, if you look at Doomsday Book, for instance, that some of them are only a few hundred acres, and then sometimes you'll see a huge manor, maybe as much as 5,000 acres. So they vary greatly in size. And there's a plethora of internal arrangements and customs within each manor. And so what I'm going to give you here is sort of a broad overview that will likely fit no single manor perfectly. It's sort of an average picture, which we often end up doing in courses like this, where we can't talk about every different type. I'll give you sort of a generic type that you can think about. When you would think about a manor, in terms of what it is physically, there are a couple of things you would expect to see there. One thing that almost every manor has is an aula, A-U-L-A, which is just a Latin word which means hall, basically. It's the manor house or the hall, and it's the central structure. It's a residence, basically. When you think about these lords, the people who held manors, if they're more substantial, if they're up in the nobility a ways, or if they're a major church person, they could hold numerous manors, and this would be particularly true of, say, the major dukes and earls in England. And these lords who held multiple manors, they tended to be itinerant. In other words, what they would do, since they would usually have large retinues, a lot of people around them that had to be supported, in order to eat, they would not stay in any one manor for any great length of time because they would overburden its resources. So they would stay at one for a while, and they would create sort of an itinerary where they would move from manor to manor to manor to feed themselves and support themselves, to hold celebrations and that sort of thing. But in every manor, you will have this internal residence, this hall. And if you're a major lord and you're itinerant, while you're not there, you would have a representative of some sort there. And we'll talk about these representatives as we move on. But it's just this, it functions first, this hall, as a residence. If you're a smaller lord, you might have only one manor, and you would be resident in that hall. And so that's sort of how that works. Beyond being a residence, what the hall also served as is as a strong point for the protection of the lord's dependents and of the villagers. In terms of a lord's obligation to the people who were beneath him, he had an obligation to protect them in times of crisis. And what he could do is, if there was a grave crisis, a threat, he could drag them all into the hall and protect them in the residence. And it was also an administrative center, basically, where the business of the manor would be conducted, where the managerial functions of it would occur as a big agricultural corporation, an agricultural entity, meant to produce a certain type of surplus for support of the lord and his retinue. So you have the hall, and as you've already encountered by reading Jocelyn or Brakelin, Abbot Sampson spent quite a bit of time out on the manors, partially because he wanted to make certain things were run properly, partially because the abbey itself, from his perspective, was sometimes kind of a snake pit. There was a lot of internal dissension that he had to deal with, and what you'll discover with a lot of these heads of major monasteries, they would spend a great deal of time away from the abbey. They weren't cloistered that much in the way that you would conventionally expect them to be. It was a very common thing. It wasn't just Samson. It was many abbots in England. A lot of the reason for this is because of their secular obligations to the king or to other nobles and that sort of thing, which would also often drag them away for various reasons. And so you have the hall, and in terms of its administrative personnel, you could have a bailiff or a steward, a bailiffus or a seneschalus, Latin words for them. This was the lord's representative, especially when the lord was an absentee lord who wasn't there all the time. One of the major responsibilities of the bailiff or the steward was to produce annually something called a compotus. This is a manorial account, and by account here I mean a business document, not a narrative. It's an annual written account. It becomes a common pattern during the 13th century onward. And I should note for England, we have literally thousands of these things that survive. And I should note on a personal level that I have read and transcribed literally hundreds of these to try to find out what's going on in landed property in England during the 14th and 15th centuries. There are a couple of manorial accounts in the Blackboard Reader, and they're kind of dire to read, but they're good for you to work your way through them to see how they work and what sorts of things they were interested in managing and how they actually did it. And so take a look at them when you get a chance. Basically, when you see these accounts, what these local lords are doing is they are in many cases emulating the accounting done by the central government. We talk about the exchequer and the pipe rolls. Well, this is just maybe a spin, sort of a riff on that type of accountancy, and it's taken down to the local level because it allows the lords to try to ensure that they get enough out of their landed endowment to be able to support themselves in terms of their own activities, whether they be military or political or religious. And so that's why they keep very careful accounts of these things. It's also a way of checking against corruption and embezzlement by your officials when you're not there, because then these people have to report to you. The account gets audited essentially to make certain that there's no sort of corruption locally going on and that you're being robbed by these people. And so you have the bailiff and the steward in the accounts. Now, in terms of an institution within the manor, you would also have something known as the curia. And by this point, you should be used to the term because we've used it in various contexts. Curia just means a court, and it can be a royal court, of course, and the kings have them. And it's these courts that end up adopting a lot of governmental functions, as you know already from our earlier discussions. The Pope has a court, which is both religious and governmental in the sense of the church as an administrative organ. Basically, these individual lords, they held courts as well, and the lord had control of justice on the manor. Pure and simple. There would be a periodic court held. By periodic, I mean depending upon the size of the manor, maybe as frequently as every 3 weeks. On smaller manors, maybe only 3 or 4 times a year, but there would be a court held. And all the villagers would be expected to attend this court. And from this court, you have a document produced. It's called a rotulus curiae, a roll of the court. And I should note also on a personal note, I have read literally hundreds of these and transcribed them. And these are a lot more interesting than the accounts because they're not just numbers. They actually reveal what's going on in the life of the village. And you see individual villagers their personalities emerging, their activities emerging, and you also see the personality of the Lord and the Lord's representatives in the manor. And so basically the court served a number of functions. Before I get into those, I should remind you that you have extracts from several court rolls in the Blackboard Reader. You should take a look at those. I think actually in terms of what we're doing with this topic, it's better that you listen to the lecture first, then look at the documents, because some of the documents can be a little opaque. And by listening to this, you'll have a much easier time sort of figuring out what's going on in some of them. But you should also look at one of the extra overheads I've posted, the one that deals with Cressingham. It's one of the court rolls that you have in the Blackboard Reader. The reason why you want to look at this particular outline, it's not really an outline, it's just a list of every sort of type of transaction that goes on in that court, placed into broad categories. And it'll give you some sort of sense of the range of activities, what these courts were actually responsible for. In the most basic sense, the court for the Lord was a means to exercise and preserve authority, to keep the peasants in line and doing what they were supposed to do, and to remind them of it, to remind them of the Lord's authority. And you see just a wide range of the way this power is exercised. For instance, if a couple of peasants want to get married, they have to get the Lord's license to do this. And there's a very specific reason for this, because not all peasants were the same. As we move on, you'll discover that there were peasants that were called free peasants, and then there are villeins or non-free peasants. And the point is, if the Lord doesn't control marriage, if a villain man marries a quote-unquote free woman, their children would legally be free. And not free in the sense that we understand it, and we'll talk about that later. But the point is, they wouldn't be necessarily liable for labor services. And the Lord wants to preserve the provision of labor services, so he wants to control marriage in reference to the peasant status. Also, it allows him to exercise a fee. He can charge them for the marriage license, which he can then stick in his pocket, basically. In addition to this, you'll often see peasants making a payment called Heriot, H-E-R-I-O-T. What this was is that, say you have a peasant family and daddy dies, which happens to all of us eventually. In order for the rest of the family to continue to hold their portion of the holding on the manor, it was required that Heriot be rendered. What Heriot was the family's best piece of livestock. And so the Lord actually benefits from this material. He gets a nice piece of livestock out of it. And it also served this continuing symbol of these people's subjection to the Lord. Because theoretically, these people, these unfree, they don't own anything. The Lord allows them to use this stuff, and there is sort of a sense of inheritance here. There's an expectation. But what the Heriot generationally symbolizes is the Lord's right to take everything if he wanted. That these peasants had no inherent right to continue to hold this property. And this is a symbol to remind them of it every time somebody dies and somebody else wants then within that family to take over this holding. You also have all transfers of land registered in the court roll. And again, you get into this very interesting legal area here, because technically these people don't own it, but the Lord permits them to transfer the use of it. And he regulates this very carefully. He also charges a fee for the transfers. And so he sticks that in his pocket as well. The court also was a forum in which the Lord could enforce obligations. And a standard of performance of those obligations. These peasants owed labor services of various types. And what if they didn't do them, then the Lord could in court charge them for not having done them. And if they didn't do them well, he could also charge them for that as well. Also, what the court provided was a place where peasants could actually resolve their disputes. Basically, these lords did not like the concept of an out-of-court settlement in a major dispute, where the contending parties resolved it themselves. To resolve a dispute, you had to buy from the lord something called a licentia concordandi, a license of concord, a license of agreement. he would charge you for your right to resolve your dispute. And so it's another source of revenue for the Lord. So what you can see here, the court does allow the Lord to exercise his authority, or her authority in some instances. That's rarer because of the nature of the society that we're working in. And it also allows the Lord income. He gets some revenue from the court every time it meets. And so he gets to use that as his own resources. It's a transfer of wealth from the peasantry, from the people who owed suit to the court, to the Lord. But beyond this, the courts could also work for the peasants in a more positive sense, because it can also serve as a type of protection, because these, the proceedings are put in a written form. Precedents are established, and you're aware already of the notion of precedent. You have creation of custom through this, and this custom can protect the peasants, because they can then demand somebody to look back into the rolls to see how an issue was resolved at a certain point. Or if there is dispute over who owns what, the court roll was an excellent place to go to try to resolve that dispute. So these rolls were kept in a long series. In some cases, in the best instances, you'll find manors where there's almost a continuous series of these records, say from the mid-13th century continuing into the early modern period, where you can trace all the activities of the court over a very long period of time. So it establishes custom in a written form, and it helps to establish some practical limits of the Lord's power over his unfree tenants. And actually, were we in class, what I would have done is I would have brought in some photographs of these things so you could see them, what they look like. They're actually physically in rolls. It's unfortunate that we can't do that. And I would have shown you a whole series of them to show you just how damn many of these things there are, because there are huge numbers of them. And this, again, is one of those things that sets England apart from other places in terms of just the pure quantity of records and the quantity of evidence that you have, particularly for the later medieval period, from the 13th century into the 14th, 15th century. You can do things with records in England that you can't do anywhere else in Europe, and that was always part of the draw for me. I've been immersed in these sorts of records for various reasons for a long time now. So you have these basic sorts of institutions within each manor. You have the residence, the hall, you have the lord's officials, you have the court as an administrative institution. Now let's talk about villagers. Actually, as I originally put this lecture together, I did it through the lens of a single villager, a guy named Hugh Miller. He was a villainus at a manor called Alwarton. And you'll discover in your reading that you have actually a survey of Alwarton, so you might want to take a look at that. You'll also notice that I've given you this extra sort of outline called Alwarton by the numbers. You might want to pull that one out, and we'll refer to it in a few moments. But basically, you have villagers. You have the Lord, we've talked about him, then you have the villagers. And you would, of course, villagers assumes a village. And what you would find in most villages, it's a standard series of things. You have roads, you have a church in almost every instance for the spiritual needs of the community. You would have a church yard, which would be used for a lot of public sorts of matters, meetings, discussions among villagers. You might possibly have a green, which would also serve the same function. And if you go into the countryside and look in villages in England, you'll still find a lot of these greens preserved, that they still exist in some fashion as these open public spaces within a village. Then you would have peasants with their own structures. They have their own dwellings. Their holdings would be called various things. They could be toffs, crofts, messuages. You have the Latin terms in your outline. Toftum, croftum, messuagium. Generally, what most peasants had, they would have a hut of some sort. They would usually have a little garden around it to produce, some vegetables, some food just for the household. And they might possibly have some outbuildings, maybe a small shed, sometimes a small barn for the livestock. In these villages, as they existed during this period, they were in a constant state of flux. New villagers would appear, new families would be created as people were born, and they would get married. Old villagers would die. It's the human story, basically. So they're in a constant state of sort of movement internally. What I'm going to give you here is sort of an average snapshot of what you would expect to find in one of these villages. And also the nature of the population in it. We'll talk about the people first. And this brings us into this concept of freedom, which you see as in quotation marks. Uh, if you look back to Doomsday Book, which is always this good baseline for this, you'll see a couple of groups appear again and again and again within these descriptions of the villages or manors in Doomsday Book. You have the liberi homines, the free men, and then you have the sokomani or soak men. These were the two sort of free groups, but this gets you into the issue of what freedom actually means. We have a very specific concept of freedom, most of us. It's freedom, in most cases, within certain constraints to do whatever we damn well please and go wherever we damn well want. And this is not how it is actually conceived in the seigneurial system. What freedom means here is not so much freedom to as it means freedoms from. And I hear somebody coming down the stairs. I wonder who that might be.
Rout, I'm coming to put the laundry in the dryer.
We have this.
It's the laundry fairy.
Yeah, we have this wonderful domestic service here. Somebody just comes down. Yes, the laundry magically appears. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway. Yeah, what a rude interruption. Some people, you just don't know what to think about them. Anyway, it's not freedom in an absolute sense. It's a type of economic freedom. It's a freedom from labor services, that these people were not expected to go out in the fields and work for the Lord. Basically, usually they owed a rent of some sort in cash. So they're technically free from labor services, but they're still under somebody's patronage or lordship. They don't have this absolute freedom of mobility that we would tend to associate with the concept of freedom. And we should note here an important distinction that's already become apparent, that having to do labor services for the Lord was a mark of servility. It meant you were servile, that your relationship was even more dishonorable.
Credit if people can see the dust in the bookshelf behind you.
Yeah, whatever.
Okay.
I don't think.
Laundry fairy out.
Yeah. Huh. Well, do you want to show your face here, or are you just going to whiz through here and make obnoxious remarks? You can say hello to everybody, since you already know some of these people.
Hi. Hello, everybody. I hope you're being well, and your families are well, and you're washing your hands a lot, and that you're helping out at home by dusting and cleaning and just taking care of your emotional and physical and mental health.
Yeah, the question is whether you're helping mine at this point.
You should dust down here.
Right.
There.
Yeah, all right.
Good heavens.
Anyway, yeah.
Have you gotten to the sheep? Aren't there sheep?
Only in a very vague and remote way.
Oh, okay. I hope you get to the sheep.
There's a personal anecdote about sheep. Yeah. Right. Okay. Excuse that interruption, please. Yeah. Things are running very strangely these days, as you might well gather. So anyway, let's talk about servility. Now, you have freedom. Now, what does it mean to be servile? Again, to refer to Doomsday Book, you'll see a whole lot of terms. I'm giving you the four most basic ones that would appear. You would have people referred to as Villani, others as Bordar-ii, others as Kotar-ii, others as Servi. Villains, boarders, cotters, slaves. And we should note that at the time of the Doomsday Book, there were still people who were considered slaves. This is something that fades out over time. As you move into the 12th, into the 13th century, slavery, in that sense of somebody being absolutely owned, more or less vanishes in England, but servility is the standard. It remains, and it becomes actually magnified because what happens with these slaves, they get bumped up slightly into this servile group. If you want to consider it sort of a promotion, neither condition was great. Obviously, slavery is worse, of course, because of the complete absence, this notion that you're being owned. But in these servile relationships, freedom is definitely constrained in a very significant way. Basically, these groups were the Lord's tenants who either owed labor services or suffered from lack of freedom, or both. And actually, both is the most common sort of thing. Now, Hugh Miller, the guy at Al Walton, he was a villain. And so we're sort of going to take a look at what Hugh would have had to do for his Lord because he was a villain, because he was in this servile condition. What he would be expected to do for the Lord every year was manifold. The first thing he would be expected to do is, in many cases, to offer food rents. and this would mean some of his grain and some of his livestock. Uh, as you read through these manorial surveys, and they're interesting enough once you get into them, you'll see that a very common thing is some chickens would have to be turned over to the Lord around Christmas. Eggs would be turned over around Easter. Well, does that sound familiar? Sometimes other types of livestock. So you have basic food rents. Grain rents were fairly common as well. And so you have these food rents, just some of whatever he produced, or he and his family produced, actually. You would also see cash rents. You have rents expressed in money. And this is interesting. What would be the origin of these? Well, in all likelihood, these are old food rents that had been converted into cash, which tells you as you move into this period, there's a transformation of the economy. It becomes more monetized and there's more money in circulation. Funny thing, one of the things I was going to bring into class, and I would have probably brought it in earlier than this lecture, I actually own a 14th century silver penny minted during the reign of Edward III. It was a very considerate, actually, birthday gift from my wife, this person who just so rudely interrupted us a few moments ago. She went over, there's this amazing sort of antiquity store right across from the British Museum in London. And when I needed coins for use in class, I would go there to pick up Roman coins. Medieval coins are actually more expensive, and so this was a really big gift. And so I'm very proud of it. I wanted to bring it in, but I couldn't bring it in because of the movement from Ryland Hall to Sarah Brunet. I'd lent it to Joanna, and it got packed up and stored somewhere. And so I've been separated from my penny. But this actually offers a good moment to give you a slight digression on the nature of money, because as you read through these documents, you're going to see a lot of sums of money expressed. And in terms of how money was done in England, we'd already mentioned, I think, earlier in the course that the word libra or pound, that's basic unit of accounting in British money, it refers literally to a pound of silver. And it's and within that, you don't see tons and tons of pounds minted. They were. But the reason why I want to bring this up is that I don't want you to get confused by numbers. You still have the pound in England in 2021. It's their basic unit of currency because the Brits never went over to the euro, and they're probably glad they did that because for a variety of reasons. But the money now in England is decimal. In other words, they have 100 pennies to a pound. That's not how it worked in the Middle Ages. A pound of silver could be divided into 240 pennies. So you had 240 pennies to the pound, and their intermediate unit between that would be the shilling. And the shilling each one of those contained 12 pennies, which meant that you would have 20 shillings to the pound. And so that's the basic sort of conversion. That's what those numbers mean as you encounter them. The terms that they would use for this libra was pound. For shilling, it would be the term solidus, S-O-L-I-D-U-S. Their term for penny was denarius, D-E-N-I-R-I-U-S. And so, funny thing, actually, when British currency went decimal, and that was right around 1970, they finally got rid of the shillings. It meant also that they changed their abbreviations for penny. Basically, if you look at old British postage stamps or old British coins, or as they would refer to money in any document prior to 1970, when they're referring to a penny, the abbreviation would be D because they were still using denarius as the basis for that. And actually, funny thing here, well, I'll just flip this around a little bit so you can see it. There is no greater nerd than I am, and what you see on this particular shelf here, those are my stamp albums. And you see there are a whole bunch of them. I have a worldwide collection, which I began when I was 11 years old. And I have a whole lot of British stamps, and if you go through my British stamp collection, you see that shift in the stamps, where they altered the abbreviation at that point because the making of their money decimal, because it's a lot easier to count it that way, and it's a more standardized way of doing things. Of course, since I've worked a lot with medieval accounts, everything is non-decimal, and done in Roman numerals, actually, not in Arabic numerals for the most part. And so if you're going to do that type of history, you get used to that, and you get very good at doing the conversions in your head. And then you'll also actually see us in some of the documents money expressed in terms of marks. What a mark was 2/3 of a pound. That meant that it was 13 shillings 4 pence. And yes, there will be a quiz later, and I'll test your ability to actually convert money fast in a non-decimal system. So anyway, but what it tells you, because they're doing these cash wrench, is that the economy is becoming very monetized by this point. That actually you could charge these rents because the money was in circulation. And in England, you have a lot of these silver pennies minted, and we have mint records for a lot of it. So you know how many roughly in any given year were out in circulation somewhere. So Hugh Miller would give up food rents, he would give up some cash rent, and then he would perform his labor services. Basically, the most common type of labor service was something called week work. This was usually 3 days per week on the Lord's land. And I'd referred to this a little bit in class, but now we'll refer to it again just to make certain that you're clear on it. Within every village that a lord holds, every manor, some of the land would be granted out to the tenants so they could support themselves, and they would get the produce, at least some of it, off that land. Part of it would be reserved for the Lord's farm, and that land that was reserved would be called the domain, Demesne. It's a French word that's commonly used to refer to it. And so what this week work means is that for usually 3 days a week, each peasant family would have to provide a worker to toil on the Lord's domain acreage for the Lord's benefit. So that was where the Lord got his labor. And you would see various percentages in terms of how much was tenant and how much was domain, basically. So you get these 3 days of labor giving up each week. In addition to that, Hugh or any other villain would be expected to do boon work. These are special extra added labor obligations during critical portions of the agricultural year. And if we were in class, I would ask you what they were because you could guess them in about a second. When you're trying to get the plants in the ground, when you're sowing, you would need extra labor. When you're trying to harvest them, you would need extra labor as well, where it would be all hands on deck to get the harvest in. And plowing at various points during the year, we need extra plowing services. And so those were the three that would most commonly be placed in the boon labor category. In addition to this, most peasants had also miscellaneous labor obligations, such as helping keep the roads maintained, helping to maintain and build bridges, outbuildings, fences, that sort of thing. And so you have this labor that's handed over in addition to food rents and cash rents. But this was not the limit of Hugh's obligations. Hugh was also obliged to use the Lord's monopolies. And you've all probably played the board game at some point. I hear people still do it. I never liked it. I would just get bored, actually, doing it. I guess a couple of Christmases ago, I was out for a Drell family Christmas, and they tried to get us all playing Monopoly, and I was just bored. But I'm like that with most games. I just never enjoyed playing games. I guess it's a character defect of some sort where people start playing games and I just check out and go try to find a book to read somewhere or something. But anyway, you know what it means. Monopoly means complete control of some sort of resource. And in this instance, the Lord had a monopoly on ovens. Bread was the major type of food people would eat. This was very important. And if you wanted to have your grain baked into a loaf, then you would have to use the Lord's oven exclusively. Of course, these lords tended not to do this from the goodness of their heart. There was usually sort of a quota set up where if you had so many loaves baked, then some portion of those, a percentage of them, would be turned over to the Lord for his own use. And so it's sort of like another food rent that's established. In addition to this, the mill, the water mill or windmill or both, in some cases, this was a monopoly held by the Lord, which meant that all grain, you harvest your crop, you're Joe and Joanna peasant, you harvest the crop, and to have it ground into flour so you could then bake it into bread, you would have to use the Lord's mill to do that. There was a prohibition on hand kerns or hand mills. You wouldn't be allowed to have one. If the Lord found out that a peasant family had a hand mill hidden in the house, he would come in and literally take a sledgehammer and have it broken. So you had to go there, and as was the case with the oven, this was not something that you were allowed to use because the Lord liked you. The Lord would expect a payment in grain or in cash for use of the mill. Also, the forest was a monopoly. And there are lots of nice things you can get into in the woods. You can get wood, for instance, for fuel or for building. You can allow livestock to forage in them. Pigs like the woods because they can go dig up acorns and stuff and feed on whatever's out there. You can find berries and lots of other resources in the woods. Those were the Lord's resources, and if you wished to use them, you had to give him some sort of payment for it. A real obvious payment was this thing called panagium or pannage. This was a payment that you would give to the Lord for the right to let your pigs loose in his forest and let them forage and fatten themselves up. So the Lord got another payment here. And then the ponds, any sort of water, body of water in or near the village, would be controlled by the Lord. If you wanted to fish in it, you would have to pay a fee or give some of the catch to the Lord for his own kitchen. There was also tight control of production of ale. People in the Middle Ages liked the brewski. There's no question about that. And most of virtually all manors would have a camba or a brew house for malting grain. This was a monopoly. If you want to have your grain malted and then be produced into ale, you would have to take it to the Lord's camba and again pay a fee. There were in fact manorial officials called testatores cervizii, or the ale tasters, sometimes translated as ale testers, who helped to regulate the production of ale within the village, and they answered to the Lord. So you have these monopolies, and what peasants would try to do to try to improve their own material condition, they would try to violate them as much as possible. They would try to pilfer or find another way to grind grain. They would try to get around it. But if the Lord found out about it, he would enforce it in court, basically, and fine people, immerse people, punish them for violating these monopolies. And so what you probably gathered from this point, if you're Hugh Miller, you're subject to a fairly effective extraction of your wealth. A lot of what you produce ends up going to the Lord. And this is where I would refer you to that little outline, Al Walton by the numbers, because what I did is I crunched the numbers for that manorial survey to give you a sense of what Hugh, as an individual peasant, owed the Lord in terms of labor and rents and other services, and also what the entire village owed. And it gives you this sense of how the system operated, that these peasants, in exchange for the Lord's protection of them, they gave up quite a bit. And this allowed the Lord then to free himself from any sort of agricultural labor and perform his function, usually a military political function, or if the Lord was an ecclesiastical institution, a spiritual function. But this is basically how the system worked. Everything, and it underscores this notion that everything that you see in terms of these major material achievements, the castles, the cathedrals, the churches, all of those things, this is what created the wherewithal to have that stuff. This was the fundamental agrarian basis of it. Bear in mind, you're in a society that is fundamentally and brutally agrarian. And so this is how it worked. This is not to say, however, that everything was bleak in the life of a peasant. It wasn't necessarily. And we should say just a few words about the peasantry after hours. And this is where it's very unfortunate that I can't assume that you took your copy of Judith Bennett with you. If you're really interested in how peasants live, read the Judith Bennett book. It gives you a lot of information on that. And it's done in a very entertaining way, actually. The reason why I signed the book is I placed it under the women topic because Judith Bennett tries to do it through the lens of a single peasant woman, Cecilia Pennefatter, living in a particular village where there are fairly good records of her since she was a femme sole. She was a woman alone. She was not a woman who married. And she basically kind of went into her business for herself within the village. And Judith Bennett uses it to give you a very nice picture of village life as it would have existed in early 14th century England. Now, does it actually qualify as a biography? That's an interesting question, because even with as much information as she had about Cecilia Pennefatter, you don't get the sense of biography the way we would understand biography. You know a lot of what she did, what she thought. No, that's another matter entirely. But anyway, it's a good thing to look at if you're interested, if you want to go further into this. We should note that in terms of life within the village church was a very central institution. And we should say a couple of things about that. That to support the village church and the parish priest or vicar or whatever you had sitting there, part of that support came through the tithe. And you were expected as a Christian to tithe regularly. What the tithe represented was 1/10 of your increase each year. It's not 1/10 of everything you hold. That would impoverish people, and that would tear people down over the course of a number of years. But it's 1/10 of what you gained during that year. And since these people are mostly engaged in farming, it's represented in terms of what they grow or what livestock they had. For instance, if you held sheep, yeah, my wife wants me to talk about sheep. Well, I'll talk about sheep here. If you had 10 lambs that year, one of them should have gone to the church as part of your tithe. In terms of your grain, there's an expectation, either it's usually done out in the field in sheaves, that one of every 10 one of every 10 sheaves should go to the church to materially support the official that was there. In addition to this, when a peasant died, they paid heriot to the Lord. That's the best piece of livestock. In many places, they also owed something called mortuary beast, which would be the second best beast or piece of livestock within the village. So there's a church there. It provides spiritual services, and it is supported through the material wherewithal of the tenants within the manor or village. The peasants had their houses. We should note that these houses were very impermanent for the most part. They were usually rebuilt every generation or so, and very few of them survive. They're sort of wattle and daub, in other words, mud and stick type things, and they have a tendency to melt. And so we don't have a lot of peasant houses that survive from the period. If they survive, it's because they usually were later converted into stone. In their original state, you have medieval archaeologists can find the basis of them, the bottoms of them, but generally you don't have very much of it ever standing that existed during that period. If you were a more affluent peasant, a richer peasant, you might separate animal from human habitation within your house. We should note that livestock would often be in the house because in the colder months they provided warmth. To give you a counterexample of that, I'll talk about my grandfather for a second. As I think I've already mentioned, my grandfather, he passed away back in '99. But since people in my culture get married young, I knew him pretty well. I was 39 at that point, so I'd known him for a good part of my life. The old bean, in terms of most of his life, he was a tobacco farmer. But prior to this, he experimented with various other types of husbandry. And I've told by my mother that he used to have sheep. I've seen pictures of them. Back around 1960, about around the time I was born, I was in Ohio. I was born in Ohio, actually, and later moved back down to Kentucky. It got so cold one winter that I guess for part of the winter, he kept the sheep in the house. And I can only imagine how unpleasant that was. Because I will tell you, sheep are living crap machines. I guess he kept it clean enough, but he had the sheep in the house to keep them warm. From the peasant's perspective, it was they weren't trying to keep the sheep warm, they were trying to keep themselves warm. And so they would often have livestock in the house. Which tells you that sanitation could be somewhat of an issue. In addition to the church and the houses, you have greens, streets, and churchyards as places of assembly. We should note about villagers that they often cooperated with one another and they would socialize with one another, but they also had a tendency to prey on one another. And so you have sort of this, could be a tense dynamic in some cases. You would often find taverns in the villages, frequently near churches. These taverns were usually set up in private homes as sort of private operations. You would see within villages, because of feast days and that sort of thing, dancing, drinking, brawling, affrays were pretty common among the villagers where they would get drunk and get into fights and stab each other and beat each other and crap like that. They would tend to get drunk and slander each other, assault each other. Sometimes they would kill each other. And this stuff shows up in your manorial courts in various ways. We should note that within village life, feasts were very important. There were a lot of them in the liturgical calendar, and there were also feasts at rites of passage, such as marriage, would be the most common one. When you would have these feasts, they would be basically organized gluttony and drunkenness, where people would get to eat a lot and drink a lot. Here I recommend you to Braveheart because you get to see a wedding celebration where they're playing great games and stuff, and they start throwing rocks at each other and crap like that. And it has a very that particular marriage. It ends in a very it ends in a very bad way where you have that prima nocte business being expressed. But this was very common. These feasts were just part of life in a village where you have some that's a little lighter and a little brighter compared to sort of the normal existence there. You would have trespasses and burglaries where people would break into each other's houses. And when you would have actually a burglary like this, it was literally called house breaking because you could break the house. You would just kick in the wall at some point and go in a lot of instances. We should note, it's one of the things we don't think about much, but nights in the Middle Ages, or particularly if you're out in the countryside, would be very different than how we experience them. I frequently ride a bicycle, and I'm probably going to start doing it again here over the next couple of days because I can't go to the gym now, and I need a source of more systematic exercise so I don't gain a lot of weight while we're closed up in the house. But anyway, in a place like Richmond, you go out at night, and so, I have an insomnia issue. You may notice that sometimes I will email people at peculiar hours because I'm up at 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. And sometimes if the insomnia bug hits me, I'll go out in the garage, jump on my bicycle, and go ride 20 miles at 3 in the morning. And the point is that even though I have headlights on my bicycle and I use them to ride around most of Richmond, I don't need them. Because we have street lights everywhere, particularly in the part of town I live in the museum district, more downtown. And so we never experience really true darkness in a place like Richmond, or probably in most of your neighborhoods because of street lighting. In the Middle Ages, it was dark. If you didn't have a moon out, you could probably barely see your hand in front of your face. And what you see, of course, is that in this level of darkness, life can be a little bit more dangerous at night, partially just through accidents, that people would wander out and not pay much attention to what they're doing, and they might actually trip and fall into a well. That was actually pretty common, believe it or not. Also, you would have these nocturnal thieves that they would actually, under literal cover of night, they could rob people. And so it's a little dangerous to be out at night, more so than we would understand it. And so there's a bit of fear more so associated at night than perhaps we think about it. Also, it can be very cold at night, and you have a lot of death from exposure where people get out and don't come back in. I should, again, note as a quasi-biographical, not autobiographical, but biographical, within my family, my great-grandfather Fielden, who was the father of my grandfather Jesse Gilbert. Fielden was, well, I can't think of a nice way to say this. He was kind of the village drunk, severe alcoholism, and died relatively young. But the story with him, what happened to him eventually, he lived out in a cabin, and in terms of other kind of interesting or non-interesting personal biography, that cabin, it was back a bunch of old gas plant roads way back in a remote place not too far from where I grew up. And when I was a teenager, my mom got very ambitious, and she bought the cabin from the person that owned it at that point, which was a relative, and had the cabin disassembled and reassembled closer to where we live. And so we own essentially my great-grandfather's one-room cabin that he lived in. He went out, apparently, I think he's probably about half drunk, and tripped or something, injured himself, and that's how he died. He died of exposure. He froze to death, basically. So that can even happen in modernity, actually. Bad way to go. But you have these activities, you have some danger, but you also have some bright elements in peasant life, and you don't want to lose track of that, the importance of feasts and that kind of thing, and their social interactions as a community. One other point about the peasantry: it is possible to be manumitted. Basically, leads to a question: why would a lord manumit or free a peasant? Well, it's usually for a payment of some sort, although it could be done for other reasons. And within your documents, you actually have a manumission where a lord has manumitted somebody, and you get to see the details of how it actually worked. Another possibility is flight. A peasant could flee. the manor. But this is a very risky thing for reasons that we'll talk about a bit later. Now, so that's the basic structure. That's what a manor's like. And as you read through your documents, you'll see various iterations of this. Now, as sort of a transition, as a segue to go from countryside to city, we should say something about the so-called agricultural revolution of the Middle Ages. Basically, there were some developments that marginally boosted productivity during the Middle Ages. And this is one of the bases for population growth. If you have a more productive agriculture, you can support more population. Very obvious thing. Why did this occur? Well, one part of it is the sense that maybe there were some changes in climate that made agriculture better during the High Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages, as far as we've been able to reconstruct it through the evidence that's available, it was cooler and wetter, period. When you move into the High Middle Ages, you begin to see warming occurring, as far as people can tell. That there's an era of glacial retreat from around 750 until around 1150. And what this meant is that you could have longer growing seasons and you could place more arable into production. In other words, lands that had been too wet or it had been too cold to actually be agriculturally productive, they can then be farmed. So it means that you have just more acreage in cultivation. And obviously, this inevitably leads us to think about the current issues regarding climate. And I'll leave that there for your own consideration. Obviously, our issue is to what extent what's happening now is man-made in terms of greenhouse gases, greenhouse emissions, and an increase in world temperature, which leads to climatic issues. My only hope here in reference to this now, in our present situation, is that the weather will not be too weird for the next number of months, because with everybody locked in and all this other business going on, we don't need natural disasters occurring any more than absolutely necessary. And so I hope, at least for a time, that we get lucky and we don't have some of that stuff going on that's been going on with greater frequency over the last number of years. We'll say in my lifetime, the weather has gotten worse. There's no question about that. And what you attribute it to, I'll leave that to your own judgment, but it is a real change, actually. So you have climate as an issue. You also had some technological improvements, which made agriculture a bit better. You had greater availability of iron implements. Iron is in greater supply in Northern Europe than it is in the Mediterranean region. And you see the opening of mines during the 8th and 9th century, particularly in Germany, but also in England to some extent. So it meant that it was more possible for peasants to have iron implements. And as it is for military matters, if you have iron or steel, you're much better off. They're more effective tools, easier to use, more productive. In addition to this, you see a specific technological innovation, something called the heavy plow, the Karuka or Eritrum, as it is sometimes called. This is a plow that has an iron coulter, which is just basically a knife that extends down into the soil to cut the turf. It has a horizontal plowshare. In other words, it curves around and becomes horizontal. And it has a thing called a mold board. And you put these three things together, it allows you to cut a very deep furrow and then turn it over and expose the soil. And so this is part of the reason why it's such a good plow. It has wheels for transport and also to control the depth of the cutting in the soil. And so it's better suited for northern clay soils. And I want to remind you here that as we were looking at the Bayou Tapestry, in the bottom register, you see a really good depiction of one of these wheeled plows. And so it's a real thing that people drew pictures of, actually. The larger point here is that as this plow cuts the soil, it buries weeds, and it would bring a lower level of soil, presumably a more fertile soil that hadn't been used yet, to the surface. It also created ridge and furrows in the field for better drainage. And so it was actually a really great innovation in terms of agricultural technology. But since it was a big plow and it had to cut through this very heavy soil and turn it, it required quite a bit of traction. You need a substantial team to pull it. In Doomsday Book, a plow team was considered to be 8 oxen. That was their standard unit for it. And it's often depicted that way, where you'll see oxen tied to a plow in ranks, 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, to pull it. This heavy plow easily created strips in elongated fields because it was difficult to turn around. So what you want to do is plow as far as you could plow before topography or ownership or whatever compelled you to make a turn, because you didn't want to waste a lot of land making the turn, essentially. And so you see these long plowing strips established within these fields. And if I were in class, I would show you just basic illustrations of this, but you can imagine it. It's not that complex a thing to really think about. What it meant, of course, these big plows, is that agriculture becomes a very communal activity. Because if you're a peasant, it's unlikely you could own your own plow and have support 8 oxen to pull it. For the peasants, they would pool resources, which means that they would plow together as a group. And they would do this both on their own land and on the Lord's land. And the Lord would provide some plow teams as well, and plows. But this is sort of how it worked. It becomes a communal activity. You don't go out and work alone on this. You work as a group, basically. And in this system, you have the creation of this thing called the open fields, where basically within you have these big fields where they've plowed as long as they could possibly plow, and you have strips within the fields. And the way it would work is that each tenant would have a certain number of strips scattered across each of these open fields to sort of equalize quality of land. And since the activity was communal, and the Lord strips would be intermixed within the peasant strips. And so people didn't tend to hold land in most cases in compact blocks. They had a series of strips within each field within the village. You have this absence of contiguous holdings. They're all intermixed. This plow and its effect on agriculture, it spreads from the 6th through the 9th centuries, and that's how you get the creation of these sorts of fields that you saw in Europe during this period. And actually, if you go up in a plain, you can actually look down and you can still see these ridge and furrow patterns in a lot of fields in England. Many of them extend back centuries, where they had the use of this plow. It made this permanent impression on the landscape in England. So you have the heavy plow. There's also actually another innovation that appeared. You have actually several of them: the horseshoe, the padded horse collar, and the tandem harness. Horses are interesting in that they're able to pull loads similar to what an ox can pull, but they're twice as fast. And so that means that if you could actually use horses on a plow team, you could get a lot more done. And you can also transport things more quickly using horses. The problem was, when you think about antiquity, people in antiquity, they were very sophisticated if you think about Roman and Greek antiquity, but they never figured out how to actually harness their horses well. They would try to harness the poor horses around the neck, which meant that when the horse pulled, it would gradually asphyxiate itself. Which meant it just couldn't pull very hard because the horse doesn't want to suffocate, basically. And so what was created in medieval Europe, and these medieval people can be very innovative in some respects, they created this thing called the padded horse collar, where the weight is distributed in terms of pulling on the horse's shoulders rather than around the neck. And then they developed horseshoes to allow them their hooves not to get too banged up from doing this. And then they created the tandem harness where you could actually put the horses side by side rather than having sort of a yoke arrangement as you would have had with oxen during this period, which meant that you could begin to use horses more for your agriculture. And this made it, again, by another degree, a little bit more productive. And so you see these basic technological innovations. There was also an innovation in agricultural practice that boosted productivity in terms of field systems and crop rotations. And I know, this sounds pretty boring to you, and it is kind of boring. I will freely concede that, but it's significant. The fundamental shift is from one field system to another. The older field system would be a 2-field system. The new system would be a 3-field system. Well, what is the fundamental difference? In the case of a 2-field system, you would have one field devoted to winter crops. These would be your big high-quality grain crops, basically wheat and barley would be your two basic choices. So one field would have your winter crops, meaning that they are planted in the winter and are harvested in the fall sometime. And then one field would be fallow. By fallow, we mean nothing would be on it, because they would need each year to let at least one half of their land sit so that it could sort of revivify itself. where it could recover from having been cropped the preceding year. And so one year you would have your wheat field, and the other field would be fallow. You would shift it the following year, where the fallow field would become your wheat field, and your former wheat field would be your fallow field. And so this is a two-field rotation. Then you begin to see a shift in many places to a three-field system. And this doesn't seem like a huge innovation, but it's a very significant one. What this means, of course, if you divide your land into three fields, it means 2/3 rather than half of it is in production every year, which means that you just have more acreage producing something. And the way they would do this, one field would be your winter field. So you'd have your wheat field. One field would be your fallow field. Your third field would be spring crops that you would plant in the spring and that would mature at about the same time as your winter crops. So you have more crops, and you also have a greater diversity of crops. The advantage here, of course, more land in production. That was obvious. It also means you could put more acreage into legumes. And if we were in class, I would ask you what these were, and you would think about it for a second, and you would begin to tell me that legumes are peas, beans, clovers, and vetches. You might not talk about clover and vetches, but peas and beans you would understand. These are important because legumes bind nitrogen into the soil. In other words, by having these crops, it serves as a natural fertilizer and can boost your productivity. What's also nice about these crops is that they provide another source of protein. They're vegetable protein as opposed to animal protein, which means that you have more protein in the human and animal diet, and this is all to the good. It would help people in their health and nutrition. And it's another spur to population growth. It made people healthier, made livestock healthier. It allowed you to support a larger population. And so actually, interesting thing, there's Italian writer, a man named Umberto Eco. He wrote a very famous novel back in the 80s called The Name of the Rose, which was turned into a movie starring Sean Connery and a very young Christian Bale back in the 80s. It's about a medieval murder mystery that occurs inside a monastery, a Benedictine house in northern Italy in the early 14th century. Well, Umberto Eco's a fascinating man. He passed away a few years ago. He was basically a man who studied language, and he was a professor at the University of Bologna. And as we approach the millennium, the year 2000, back 20 years ago, a lot of people were asked what they thought the most important development in the last 1,000 years had been. And Eco had an interesting and very smart answer. He said it was the bean. It was the legume. Because he very correctly noted that this boost to agricultural productivity during this period, a lot of it depended upon this. That by introducing this into animal and human diet and introducing it into the agricultural cycle, it allowed a lot more food to be produced and it improved people's health. It boosted population. It boosted surpluses so people could do other things. And so it's a very important innovation. In addition to this, they would try to fertilize their soil, but they were very limited. They couldn't go to the southern state store and buy a bag of nitrogen oxide, which I should note. I've worked a lot of agriculture, and I've used a lot of that stuff over the years. I remember working out in tobacco and hand casting that garbage all over the place. They were very limited. They had basically manure, human and animal feces was the principal source of fertilizer. There was a type of soil called marl that they could dig up and try and spread out into the fields, or they could use sea sand to get the qualities from that. But that was just about the limitation of it. In addition, however, to these technological shifts and shifts in practice, you also see expansion. Whereas the weather improved, you saw a lot of assarting and drainage. What assarting is clearing land from forests, cutting down trees and putting it into agricultural production. You see expansion of cultivation in England up into the Yorkshire Highlands through a lot of just tree clearance because the weather had gotten warmer. They could clear forest and place it into agricultural production. You see the draining of marshes and wetlands in eastern England, particularly the Wash. A lot of that was placed into production at this point because the weather had gotten warm enough and the drainage technology was such that you could actually do that. So you see a lot of forest clearance and draining of wetlands during this period, and you see it being placed into production. What this meant was greater productivity. But even with these improvements, the yields were appallingly low by modern standards. And so what did this mean? Well, for the peasantry, it meant a sometimes marginal existence. In a good year, you might have some surplus. if you were a peasant. Once you'd met all your obligations, you'd have a little extra. And in most years, it was possible to scrape by. So, you were sort of at the margin. But some years they would be on the edge of starvation if the crops had not been that good. And in a poor year, though, there was the potential for famine, a major shortfall. But in general, there was not any European-wide famine during the High Medieval period. From around 1000 to 1300, most years you got by well enough if you were a peasant. I should note ominously, this does not continue, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But what it did mean is that if you were a noble or someone engaged in ecclesiastical activities, there was a sufficient surplus produced and sort of creamed off from the peasantry for you to be able to engage in your activities, whatever they were. But this was a great and inescapable drain on the resources of the peasantry. They paid for this, basically, in the most fundamental way. And you begin to actually have a surplus sufficient to support some other people in non-agricultural occupations. You begin to see potential for increased specialization. And we should note that this surplus was the sine qua non, the essential thing for the development of commerce, manufacturing, and urbanization. What you do see during this period is population growth. And I can give you a couple of sort of ballpark numbers here. If you look at Doomsday Book and you play all kinds of statistical legerdemain, you might conclude that around 1086 that there were maybe around 2 million people in England. Good number as any. It's a nice round number. People can dispute either way about its accuracy. Then jump up a couple of centuries, say to around 1294. An estimate of that year suggests that maybe population was around 7,200,000. This tells you that over the course of a couple of centuries, you maybe had a tripling of population, which tells you something, that agriculture had improved, where you could have more people actually supported on the basis of what was being done in the countryside. And this is the perfect segue into what is becoming a very long lecture, but I knew this would be the case. And like I said, you might want to divide this into a couple of chunks. If you think you can't stand it anymore, take a break. Smoke them if you got them, and come back later. I'm going to continue because I just want to get this over with and get this out to you so you can have it. But this is an important segue into towns, our topic for the remainder of the hour. Say, for instance, you go back to Hugh Miller, the villain. Say he got mad as hell and couldn't take it anymore. And he decides to vote with his feet and go to the big city, such as it existed at this point. What did he encounter? And I should note, parenthetically, I have several alter egos. Dobby the House Elf is one of them, as I've probably already told you. I sometimes think about myself as somebody like Hugh Miller, because I grew up in an aggressively rural environment. I visited home a couple of weeks ago, and I was taken on a tour of where my grandparents and great-grandparents and my great-great-great-great-grandparents lived. I should note that the person who is, if you basically think about it patrilineally, going through, starting with my mother's grandfather, and you go through his male line. The person that arrived in Kentucky, in sort of the area where I lived on the border between Hart and LaRue counties in central Kentucky, he arrived sometime between 1850 and 1860. He was my great-great-great-grandfather. And, I sometimes have been known to stereotype myself as being somewhat of a hillbilly. On my last trip back to Kentucky a few weeks ago, I went on a ride with my uncle through that area. And all the leaves were down because it's the middle of winter, and I could see the topography better. And yeah, my forebears in that part of the county, which is not the most mountainous place in the world, they were kind of hillbillies, actually, because of the topography there. It is very hilly, more so than practically any part of the county where I grew up. And I didn't really realize that growing up because I didn't live down there. I lived in another part of the county. But anyway, I do sometimes see Hugh Miller and people like him as another one of my alter egos, because I'm somebody who eschewed the country life and headed to the big city. And that made me kind of unusual in terms of the people in my generation in that family, most of whom are still back in that part of the world. That's part of the reason why I go back for a visit occasionally. and I am actually considered to be what passes for the black sheep of the family. I'm the weird one no one really understands and thinks is a little strange at most of the family gatherings, and you don't want your kids talking to me because I'll fill their heads with nonsense. Yeah, I'm that crazy uncle. But anyway, when Hugh leaves to the town, what does he encounter? Well, to have a town for him to encounter, there were two basic prerequisites. First, as we already know, you had to have a surplus food and surplus population. This agricultural revolution permitted marginally more people to engage in occupations other than agriculture. And superior agriculture created more disposable income to purchase manufactured goods and luxury items. What you begin to see is the creation of something like a consumer culture that we would recognize, where you take your extra income and you devote it to certain types of luxuries or things that you don't want to make for yourself. You can have somebody else, a specialist, make them for you. The other prerequisite is political stability, that you had the end of the Viking raids and a settling down after that. So you have an end to the external invasions, and you have the establishment of more effective government, which means a more stable, more peaceful society. And we've already talked about that in great detail, how you have these legal and political institutions that emerge over the time that allow England to be more peaceful. And so you put these two things together, this allows towns to begin to emerge. So we'll first talk about the place. When Hugh would try to go to town, what would he encounter? The first thing he would encounter would be a wall. Part of what defines towns in the Middle Ages is the existence of a wall. It's the most prominent feature of most towns. And these walls would be expanded as necessary. As the town grew, they would move them outward. And if you look at actually, I know a number of you have been to Europe, you've been into the medieval core of modern European cities, and you discover that they're very cramped, they're very tight in a lot of cases. If you have an aerial photograph of a lot of these towns, what you'll see is a concentric sort of structure where you have the original town wall, then you see a point later where it was expanded, and you might see a point later where it's expanded again as the town moved out from its original location. So you have these walls. The construction, maintenance, and expansion was the greatest expense of many of these towns, the maintenance of the walls. Many towns began as fortresses, and these fortresses attracted a merchant presence, a presence that eventually became permanent. Others, the merchants start first and the walls are constructed later. It can work in either direction as far as that goes. If you want to see a really excellent example of town walls, go to York in northern England, because a great bit of the town wall is still walkable there, where you can make not a totally complete circle, but a pretty good circuit of the city when you go to York, and they are absolutely impressive in a major city like York. England was a little unusual in regard to walls. You have fewer walled towns because of the curbing of private castles. We talked about the adulterine castles under Henry II. The king always has a reluctance to let a lot of the nobles have big castles, and so you see fewer of these, but you still have walls in many of the British towns. So you have the walls, and I should note that the walls, they serve to protect the town. They also serve as a demarcation of a type of legal status. There's a different type of legal understanding within towns as opposed to outside towns, which will become evident as we move on. Within the towns, he would also encounter gates and major thoroughfares. You have to have a way to get in, and so there would be a number of gates that would allow entree. These would be guarded and fortified gates. Again, York is a great example of that. You go look at what they call the bars in York. Those are the gates and the little fortresses and turrets and stuff that they set up to actually protect the gates, which you can still move in and out under within the town. Each town was unique, but commerce usually concentrated near the gates because there was usually more room there as the towns expanded, and there was a lack of space in towns. They have very narrow streets in these medieval core towns. These streets are equivalent to modern alleys in the American understanding of it. When you have European friends come over to America, what they always marvel at, well, a couple things about our streets. First of all, they're so wide. Even the street I live on, it's a fairly wide street by Richmond standards. They look at it and say, wow, all that space. And also the straightness of it, and they can run for miles with the same street name. We have 11 and 1,200 blocks and that kind of thing. You have these very narrow streets. In most cases, shops would be on the ground floor, and homes of the shopkeepers would be on the upper floor The buildings tend to protrude outward because they extend the beams on the other floor to create greater space on the second floor and a third floor if there is one. Which means that these streets can be a little bit dark. Sunlight gets cut off. Again, York provides an excellent example of this. When you're in York, go to the street called the Shambles, where you'll see all these extended beams in these medieval era shops there. Uh, One thing about towns, there was a lack of sanitation in many of them. Animals tend to run free and drop their feces everywhere. People would dump garbage into the streets, and that garbage included chamber pots. Not a lot of great plumbing during this period, so you keep a chamber pot in your room in case you needed to relieve yourself. For those of you who have read Voltaire's Candide, you'll know what I'm talking about. Candide is sort of this naif who principal character in the novel, which you should read at some point if you haven't. It's a great novel, actually written by the Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire. Candide's kind of a naif. He goes into the town first time, and the thing that happens to him almost immediately as he's walking down the street is that somebody hurls a chamber pot on him. He gets basically crap and urine rained on him just as he enters town. I wonder what Voltaire was trying to say about that. But anyway, in these towns, you would have trash heaps and dung heaps, and some of the businesses, say tanning, that sort of thing, created noxious and then sometimes toxic waste. These towns could be pretty damn nasty, no question about it. So it's an exciting place, it's a vibrant place, but to go into town, you could count on probably having your life expectancy reduced just a little bit. And it's an interesting point to make now, as you've been following the news, and I assume you all have been because that's all just about everybody's doing these days. There's no NCAA tournament to watch. Yeah, that hurt. But if you think about our present crisis, you'll understand that New York is suffering gravely right now. Their outbreak, in terms of numbers and in terms of mortality, is higher than anybody else's. Part of this may be because it started earlier there, but part of it, you can be assured, is because of a greater ease of transmission. Because when you have high population density, people living on top of each other, it means that it's much easier for something like an epidemic to run through the population. And that's part of what New York is experiencing now. And as you probably noticed, if you've been following the news, there are other cities that are sort of following the dynamic that New York is in, although it's in an earlier phase. For instance, New Orleans is suffering gravely right now. There's a major outbreak in Detroit. Atlanta is beginning to have some issues. Chicago is having some issues. There were problems also in San Francisco and Los Angeles, but they started their mitigation measures earlier, and there are some indications that maybe they're doing a bit better. Seattle had a major outbreak, but they seem to be trending downward. But it reinforces this notion that when you live in denser populations, if you have something that's epidemic coming through, it's going to have a greater effect than it would have out in the countryside. And so we're seeing a little bit of that phenomenon now. For there, it's not an issue of sanitation because our cities, by medieval standards, are spiffy clean for the most part. It's an issue of just population density, living close together and on top of one another. It's also part of the reason why it was the wise decision not to have you guys come back to campus, because you guys do live on top of each other. Every year, and I may have already mentioned this, when you guys leave for Christmas break, we always count on a flu epidemic occurring when you get back, because you guys go out, some of you haven't had your flu shots, and you come back in and you spread it amongst yourselves, and that's why the faculty takes their damn flu shots every year, because we don't want to catch it from you. It is a sad reality. We do not have a coronavirus vaccine yet, but that is in the offing. But anyway, so these medieval events sometimes have resonance in the modern era as well. In addition to the gates and major thoroughfares and the walls, you would find other structures in these towns. A guild hall would be common in the bigger towns, such as London, York, Leicester, Stratford-on-Avon. We'll talk about guilds in a few minutes. And you would have churches, and these are signs of civic pride. If your city was in the center of a diocese where a bishop or an archbishop was sitting, you would have a cathedral. Now, what a cathedral is the church of a bishop or archbishop. And even if you didn't have a bishop or archbishop, you would have major parish churches set up and multiple churches within any major center of population. And it becomes a competitive thing, church and cathedral construction. It's a sign of civic pride to have the highest spire, to have the biggest church. These cathedrals, they become decades long and generational projects where a lot of these cathedrals are put up over a very long period of time and expanded and improved as part of the civic pride and civic competition. So you have the basic structures that you expect to see these things in most towns. Let's talk about the people a little bit. We should note first, in terms of overall population, medieval towns are small by modern standards. Most in England had maybe 1,000 or fewer people. We would barely consider that a village in our understanding, but that would be considered a fair-sized town in England. The larger towns, such as York, Norwich, or Bristol, had perhaps between 5 and 10,000 people, which would represent the entire population of the county I grew up in back when I was there at the 10,000 end. Only the greatest cities in Northern Europe exceeded 40,000 in total population. London, on the eve of the Black Death, middle of the 14th century, had perhaps 80,000 people. In other words, the city of Richmond proper, as opposed to Greater Richmond, the city of Richmond has somewhere around 3 times the number of people of London at its peak prior to the Black Death, just to give you sort of a ballpark. The metropolitan Richmond has, I think, a city of Richmond proper, and I live in the city. The boundaries of the city is sort of around Willow Lawn. If you think about moving down Monument Avenue, has about 250,000 tops, and so it gives you sort of a sense of the scale of these things during the Middle Ages. Who were these people? If you lived in the towns, you were a member of the bourgeoisie. Basically, this is where this term begins to come into play. You might be called burgenses, burgesses, burghers. All these terms mean more or less the same thing. It means that you live in the burgus, basically. So this is where we get our notion of being bourgeois. This was the creation of an entirely new social grouping. When I ask students to tell me what bourgeois means, the term that most often comes up is middle class, and that's sort of how we use it in modernity, and it sort of fits, but not quite. We should note that the bourgeoisie in these towns, it was not an undifferentiated group. You, at the upper end, would have wealthy merchants and substantial manufacturers. If you think of a non-English example, you would have merchants in Florence. You would also have the major cloth producers there because they had a major cloth industry in Florence. But beyond these people at the upper end of the scale, you would have small artisans and shopkeepers, more mom and pop type operations. And then you would have wage laborers who might own no property at all, who are renting from somebody else and working for a wage. They provide the sort of the arms and hands for these business concerns. What united these people together as a group is that most of their wealth was movable. It wasn't in land, and that they lived within a town because you have a different legal status if you're a resident of a town. And where it becomes interesting here is that this group does not fit into that nice tripartite scheme of those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. There's something different, basically. They worked, but not in the same sense that the peasants were working. And the interesting part of this, of course, is how these 3 other groups come to view this new group. What did the nobles think about the bourgeoisie? Well, they largely disrespected them, actually. From the noble point of view, commerce and manufacturing, those were considered demeaning activities. A gentleman didn't do that. If you were a lord, you engaged in politics, you engaged in warfare, and you ran your farm. You were sort of like this notion of the gentleman farmer, basically. The problems of nobles is that they tend to spend very recklessly, and they fall into debt. And as the bourgeoisie appears on the scene, they seek loans from the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie understood that these nobles, they're not really great credit risks. They were reluctant to loan to them. And so the nobles tend to view the bourgeoisie as being stingy, as being a bunch of skinflints. And they were skinflints who were engaging in a dishonorable occupation from the noble perspective. Interesting thing, many merchants, they become rich enough to be on a par with the nobility. And, you know, but the nobles don't want these people to buy in, even if they could. And so what you see over time is a greater emphasis upon birth as the mark of nobility, that you must be born into it. This is a way to exclude the bourgeoisie uh, from it, to keep them outside of it. And you begin to have this notion, it's common in a lot of societies, of old money versus new money and the nouveau riche and that sort of thing. Well, they were placed in that nouveau riche category. Um, so you have basically the attitude of the nobility. What did the peasantry, the people on the countryside, think of them? Well, actually, if I were in class, I would make this very clear because I'm from this peasant background. Actually, I had people in high school, people that I did not much like, refer to me as that damn peasant from Mount Sherman. Tell you what that means at some point. Yeah, and we get down to name calling. I always wore it as a badge of honor, and screw you guys, basically, who would say that sort of thing about me. But to get you sort of into the mindset of the peasantry, I'm going to assume, and I think it's probably true with most of you, you are very suave, sophisticated people. You're cultured urbanites for the most part. I know there are a couple exceptions to that, but just play along with me. Uh, well, basically, I, as a peasant, fundamentally dislike you. Well, why do I dislike you? Because you're all very kind people, as far as I can tell. Because I don't trust you. Because I walk into town, and I'm wearing my Chuck Taylors with cow manure on them. And the first thing that happens is that you people take advantage of me. You take me in a game of three-card money, you swindle me in some way, we go out in the alley and play craps, and you work me over. So I don't trust you because you're too slick by half. And you're wondering, how does he really think this about us? Well, I'll leave that to your imagination. But the point is that there's a distrust there to some degree. But at the same time, because you are so suave and sophisticated, you fascinate me. You live at a higher material level to which I would like to aspire. And so I'm simultaneously repulsed by you or scared of you, but drawn to you. And so you have this weird tension here. I want to be like you at the end of the day. And have I achieved it? Well, that's a good question. I'm 59 now, going on 60. Have to mull that one over for a while. But you do have this sort of tension in terms of peasant attitudes. Drawn to it, but somewhat leery, a little suspicious, a little wary. The attitude of the church is perhaps the most interesting to the bourgeois class. We should note that avarice is a deadly sin. And if you think about it, there's a little Gordon Gecko going on with the bourgeoisie here. They like to accumulate property. They're doing business. They're trying to prosper at it. But at the same time, the bourgeoisie, they engage in a great deal of material charity. They donate property to churches. They give money to churches. They support charitable causes. But at the same time, there's another level of tension. And what the church tries to do is there are some church doctrines by which they would like the bourgeoisie to conduct themselves. The church has the notion of just price, that the just price basically is not the market price. And I could go into the theoretical elements of this, but it would take a while. But there is a doctrine about just price and just wages, how you pay people and how you set prices for your goods and services. That these concepts don't actually fit well with the notion of letting the market determine the price, what the market will bear, and let the labor market determine the price, what people will accept as a wage. And so you have that level of tension. You also have the church prohibition upon usury. And there is a church prohibition on usury. Usury is lending at interest. Actually, we have usury laws in the present day, but they've evolved into not a prohibition on lending at interest. It's lending at excessive interest, loan sharking and that sort of thing. But you have this tension where these people do a lot materially for the church, but at the same time, the church has an issue with them because the nature of their activities is considered fundamentally sinful by the church. And so the question is, for the church, how do you negotiate that sort of thing? And how does the bourgeoisie negotiate having this stuff preached at them? That what you're doing, well, you're doing a lot for charity, but yeah, you're sinning a lot here. And maybe you want to think about expiating that sin in some fashion. And so you have this very sort of interesting attitude of these other three groups within society. But in a larger sense, what the bourgeoisie represented is a threat to the notion of a fixed social order, because suddenly a new social order is emerging that doesn't fit into the old scheme. And we should note here that as a phenomenon of urbanization, of creation of towns in England, you also had the appearance of Jewish communities. And we should say a little bit about them because they're quite significant during this period. Jews began to enter England in significant numbers after the Norman conquest. There hadn't been a lot in England prior to that. They began to have the establishment of Jewish communities. They were legally free, but they technically belonged to the king and they were under his protection. So they have a special royal protection as they emerge into communities. Under Henry I, Jews were only resident in London. That was a single Jewish community sort of encapsulated in England at that point. But during the anarchy with Stephen and Matilda, they dispersed to other towns. And by 1221, you have Jewish communities, recognized Jewish communities in 17 towns in England. Actually, Bury St. Edmunds is one of those towns, as you probably discovered from your reading of Jocelyn and Brakelin. Basically, what happens in the Middle Ages is, obviously, Jewish communities become very much associated with financial occupations. The main reason for this is not because that was necessarily what they wanted to do, but there were so many restrictions placed on them in terms of other occupations and in terms of their own sense of the degree to which they should intermingle with non-co-religionists, that they get kind of encapsulated by law to some degree into these occupations. And so they become very important in terms of money lending. Which of course has led to a lot of very noxious and unfair stereotypes of these communities. But they do engage in this quite a bit, as you discovered from your reading of Jocelyn and Brakelin, where the abbey had fallen into debt to money lenders, some of them Christian, some of them Jewish. Basically, in terms of their heyday in England, it was during the reign of Henry II. That's when they prospered most and life was best for them. What then begins to happen, however, is you have the crusading movement emerge. And this leads to a great deal of anti-Semitic hysteria in England. In 1190, quite famously, you have the massacre of the Jewish community in York, where there was a slaughter of Jews there. And it's there you see the emergence of the quote-unquote blood libel myth, the notion that the Jews were engaging in nefarious activities against Christians, really ugly rumors, and it fomented public violence against them. And you have this very ugly story of what happened in York. And you begin to see pogroms in London and elsewhere, particularly in 1264. There was a wave of violence against Jewish communities. And as you probably noted from your reading of Jocelyn, there is an expulsion of Jews from Bury St. Edmunds at one point. This becomes a more national phenomenon. In 1290, Edward I expels the rest of the Jews from England. It's a straightforward act of plunder, basically. By this point, there were only about 3,000 Jews in England. By 1290, their numbers had greatly reduced. Many had left. And Edward, by this point, could borrow money from Italian moneylenders rather than Jewish moneylenders. So what he did is he took the Jews' remaining wealth and tossed them from the kingdom. And so they ended up going over to the continent in 1290, and the return of Jews to England is a much later phenomenon beyond the scope of this course, actually. So you have an expulsion of Jewish communities in 1290. You can set a hard line, basically, at that point. Now, in terms of these towns, they are initially under some sort of overlord, whether it's the king or a local noble or an ecclesiastical corporation. And what happens is that the inhabitants of the towns attempt over the course of time to acquire liberties or freedoms from these lords. There are two types of liberties. The first type of liberty is something known as elementary urban liberties. What do we mean by this? Well, it's the type of liberties necessary to engage in trade, the type of freedom that you have to be able to manufacture a product and trade it, or just engage in commerce of any sort. And if we were in class, I would drag these out of you because they're all kind of commonsensical. And And the guys over at the business school would be able to come up with them quite easily. But anyway, so some of you who are business majors would have been very helpful in this regard, actually, for this entire topic. You would have been helpful. I should note that in the Blackboard Reader, you have a lot of town charters. Take a look at those, because this is where you see these liberties being placed in writing and emerging in various ways from town to town. And I gave you quite a few examples of this, so you can see how it works in different places. Basically, so an understanding had to be reached with the Lord in order to have a community of merchants. The first thing they needed was a different type of land tenure. They could not be servile. So one of the freedoms that they have is freedom from any sort of labor services. To the degree that they pay anything to the Lord, it is in a cash rent, not in having to do, service in fields or anything like that. So they're free from that. They also have to have the ability to alienate property, which means they had to have the ability to have property. They get past this legal thing going on in the countryside where the peasants don't technically own anything. They have to be able to own and to take this property and dispose of it. Otherwise, they can't engage in trade. And so they get the right to hold and alienate property. They also get freedom of mobility. They're not tied to a village. They can go where they need to go to engage in their activity. They also get freedom from excessive tolls and exactions. What the Lord agrees to is not to tax them to death, because if the taxes get too high, they can't engage in business productively. And this is a continuing thing through the end of time, basically, where you have this tension between what the government wants to take in taxes and what people feel like as business people they can actually afford to pay. And you see it occurring here, or there's a restriction set on it. You also have in most of these town charters a very interesting provision. It's the year and a day provision. What is this? Well, it is a way for people to become part of the town. Basically, say I am Hugh Miller again, and I just thumb my nose at my lord, I flip him the bird and run off. So I try to get to a town. I get into the town, and I allow the public authorities to recognize that I'm there. I begin to talk to people very aggressively, and I try to find a job. I find a job. I become a wage laborer, and I work pretty hard. I do a pretty good job. I find a place to rent, feed myself, and I managed to stay in the town for a year and a day in full public sight of the residents of the town. If I can make it to a year and a day, and people know that I'm there, and I'm a productive member of the community, they will protect me from my former lord. They will declare me a member of the town at that point. And so if this person has not made any claim to me, then I have the town's protection, and I become a townsman. And this is part of the draw, because towns need to attract a continuing influx of labor because of the higher mortality rates in the city, because of the sanitation issues, violence, that sort of thing. This freedom was very attractive to peasants in the surrounding countryside. Actually, if we were talking about towns on the continent, I would mention this little phrase in German. Stadtluft macht frei. City air makes freedom. In other words, by breathing the city air, you can acquire freedom over the course of time. This is not to suggest, however, that there aren't limits on this freedom, and I'm going to give you a really great example. This is a famous example. There was a peasant named Simon Paris. He fled his village. He went to London. He apparently arrived there around 1285. And by 1300, this guy was a smart guy and a mover and shaker and upwardly mobile. He became one of the city's most prominent citizens, so he did well over a 15-year period. He lived the dream. In fact, he became sheriff of the area, a high office. So he's established himself by 1300. I guess by 1305, he got a little homesick, and he decided he was going to visit what they refer to in the documents, his villain nest. In other words, he was going to go home, maybe say hello to his mom or something, whatever. While he was in his home village, he was caught by the local ward's bailiff and claimed as a serf. Somebody recognized him 20 years later. And they were going to try to reinsert him, which is their right to do because he went home. That's the one thing that you can't do, actually, if you're one of these people who went to town. This went into litigation. It took somewhere between 5, 6, 7 years for him to finally put this past him and get the Lord to agree to let him go back to what he was doing and being this prominent member of the movers and shakers in London. So it's a great story that reflects how these sorts of things work. In addition to this freedom of mobility, you also get freedom from monopolies. Those monopolies we talked about in the countryside. But you still, with elementary liberties, you're still sort of governed by the Lord's representative. There would be a provost or praepositus or reeve in town who would be the chief political and judicial officer in the town. So this was where there was a limit to elementary liberties. You still had the Lord's representative in town, providing some degree of governance, even though you've acquired all these basic elementary liberties that allowed you to engage in commerce. Now, the other type of liberty is what we would call advanced urban liberties. This is, simplest term for it, this is self-government. And not all towns achieve this. Basically, bishops and abbots were especially reluctant to grant it to townsmen. What would often happen is that the townsmen amongst themselves would take oaths with one another to acquire self-government. They made it a project, and they swore to each other they would try to get it. Basically, what self-government means, it's the freedom to collect your own taxes and turn them over, and the freedom to elect your own officials and not have the Lord's representative there. It's to remove that completely. These oaths, they are called communes, and commune actually strikes a particular chord for some people. When some people hear the word commune, they have this image of a bunch of dope smoking, free living, hippie reprobates somewhere out in the countryside. No, that's an image. Or you might think about your grandparents back in the 60s rolling around in the back of a VW microbus. I wonder if I've placed an image in your head which you will never get rid of. I think I have. You're welcome. The point here, this is not what we're talking about. So don't confuse those things, those phenomena from the 60s with the commune here. The commune is the sworn association of townsmen. It's the common thing. That's what it means. They're going into a common agreement amongst themselves to try to get self-government. Later, if they get self-government, the term is then applied to the town itself. It becomes a commune as an institution. Advanced urban liberties do not appear in England in significant numbers of cities until the 1130s. It's fairly late development. You see them developing earlier on the continent. Different phenomenon there. But you do see, and I think you have this in your document book, Henry I's grant to London in 1130 of basically self-governance, where you have the ability then to elect their own officials. And who would they elect? Well, they'd elect a mayor, the big guy. That's where we begin to see this term cropping up. There would then be selections that might be called jurots or portmen or aldermen to form a town council. So you have a mayor and a town council. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should, because it is. One thing, I may have made this generalization earlier in the semester. If you're trying to understand modern institutions, particularly in Europe and America, and we get a lot of our institutions from Europe and from England very specifically. If you think about the institutions with which we live, they're more like what you would see in the Middle Ages than what you would have seen in Roman antiquity. That we owe more to the Middle Ages, in this respect at least, than we do to those other guys that we hark back to so often. These offices, both the office of mayor and the office of alderman on the town council, they're usually dominated by prominent members of the guilds, especially the merchant guilds, and we'll talk about the guilds in just a minute. These governments are not democracies. What they are oligarchies. It's ruled by the elite few, for the most part. It's not ruled by a single person, but it's a rule by the most prominent people within the town. Now, in terms of the commune, sometimes you would see a phenomenon called communal revolts. Oh, my wife is telling me to slow down. So I may do this for about a minute, then I'll speed up again. Okay, enjoy your lunch. These rude interruptions. I think she's doing this very much on purpose. Maybe she thinks she's being held hostage and needs to communicate with the outside world. It's sort of like a hostage video at this point. What's going on here? But anyway, these liberties were frequently gained through peaceful negotiation. But sometimes they weren't, because the Lord would just refuse to do it. A more moderate Lord might decide that it was in his or her self-interest to accept fixed annual payments from towns and remove themselves from urban affairs, to just wash their hands of it, take the money and run. And that's what a lot of them did. They thought it was a better deal than having to deal with these guys all the time. But sometimes this was not possible. And you would see violent, sometimes bloody revolts. Actually, in Bury St. Edmunds, there's a big revolt in 1327. They're a very late one, which is beyond the scope of the course, but they had a huge one there. These revolts were less common and later in England, but they do sometimes occur. They are earlier and more frequent on the continent, and they could get pretty damn ugly when they would revolt. If they managed to get a hold of the Lords Official, it often didn't end well for the Lords Official. Nasty things might happen. And so sometimes these would be granted peacefully, this status of commune. Sometimes it would take a revolt of some sort to do it. So you have this notion of liberty, self-governance, and the way to get it. Then you have the guilds. The guilds, many of them had their origins in Germanic drinking clubs. And guilds would often be found at the core of these revolts if it got to that level. They would be at the core of these communes as well, these common oaths. And I stuck in the Blackboard Reader a buttload of documents relating to guilds to let you see the kind of range of things that you would see with guilds and their activities. Initially, guilds were not differentiated or specialized. There would just be a guild, sort of the town guild. Generally, usually it's just a blanket merchants guild, and the merchants guild was always the most prominent socially and economically within a town. As time passed, you see a division of guilds into merchant guilds as opposed to craft or artisan guilds. And by the end of the 12th century, you see lots of craft guilds in many towns in England. The merchant guild retained the highest social prestige, and it had the greatest political influence in most towns. It's from the merchant guild that you usually get the mayor and the alderman, those sorts of people. What was the function of guilds? Actually, the functions were several, not just one function. They first of all had an economic or a commercial function. Basically what a guild does is it creates a monopoly within a town. And only guildsmen could trade or manufacture if it was the merchants guild. If it was a particular craft guild, only people within that guild could engage in that specific craft, because what it wants to do is to establish a monopoly on the production of a specific thing, good, or service. And it would engage in a type of quality control. The way the guild would do this would be through the apprenticeship system. To become a member of the guild, you would start out as an apprentice. In other words, you would bind yourself to a member of the guild to learn the trade for a period of years. And then once you had learned the trade pretty well, you could become a journeyman, somebody who's more or less working in the trade but has not reached full master status to become a full member of the guild. Basically, this continues until a masterpiece is produced. Once the masterpiece is produced, then you enter into the guild. That the time as journeyman, basically, you spend a number of years as a journeyman until you can open your own shop. And so that's sort of the way it works as far as that system. And membership was very tightly controlled because they want to make certain that people within the guild will have enough work amongst them to prosper as much as possible. They didn't want to get competition to become so great that people begin to go bankrupt or fail. I should note there are a couple of terms in the documents that are sometimes used to describe a guild. Sometimes you just see the word gilda, that means guild. Another word that you often see is collegium. It's like college with an IUM on the middle. You would often sometimes see a guild referred to as a universitas. It's a university, it's spelled the same way, but you drop the Y and replace it with an AS. I mention this now because we're going to refer to these terms in a later context. So keep it in mind that these are terms that refer to guilds during the Middle Ages. Basically, as towns acquired self-government, the economic function became less important and the social function became more significant. And so guilds also have a social function. Many of them function as religious fraternities. They'll associate themselves with a church or a saint in a lot of cases and help support the cult of that saint in terms of Christian worship. They also become charitable institutions where they help the poor. They engage in public service activities, that kind of thing. Uh, they become very important at funerals. If a member dies, the guildsmen will show up at the funeral to ensure that there are mourners there, and they might, in some cases, defray some of the expenses of the funeral. They celebrate great occasions, big religious feasts, particularly if there's a saint associated with the guild or a particular church associated with the guild. They will celebrate that. If members get down on their luck, if somebody's having a bad run, they will provide relief to some of the members. So they served as sort of a social safety net for the members. And also, say a guildsman dies and you have a widow and you have children, they'll help provide some sort of material relief for them until they can get on their feet in some fashion. So they come to perform these sort of social security functions in a way. Some of the guilds actually begin to establish guild schools for education of the guildsmen's children. So they have this big social function. There are, however, some potential problems in guilds. They can abuse a monopoly. In other words, they can jack prices up and not enforce quality standards sufficiently. And so monopolies can always be problematic things. And there is always the accusation that the guild structure stifled innovation, that they were fundamentally conservative in terms of practice, and they kept people from innovating in as much a way as they might have otherwise. So those are the basic institutions. Now let's talk a little bit about the activity of the towns, how it was actually conducted. Prior to the rise of permanent trading centers in towns, the problem for a merchant was how to arrange to meet with other merchants in order to exchange goods. Markets and fairs filled the void. You have markets and fairs appearing before towns appear, and they continued to exist alongside towns during the High Middle Ages. At the end of the 13th century, there was a sophisticated network of markets, fairs, and towns, sort of an integrated system, where the three would have connections with one another and move goods and services fairly effectively. I stuck into the reader a document, Reginald Derm's The Life of St. Godric. It's the life of a merchant who later became a saint, and you can read that to see how he engaged in his activities as a merchant. But before that, or as a way of actually concluding this thing, I'm going to say a couple words about markets and fairs, these other two institutions intimately connected with commerce and towns. A market was a meeting that served the needs of a local area. It would meet frequently, usually about every week. And it was a place to sell and exchange cheap and perishable goods. And I should note that these markets still exist in towns, modern towns in England. I've spent a lot of time in Bury St. Edmunds, as you probably already gathered, for a variety of reasons. And on my first trip there, I needed a place to live, so I rented actually an attic room from a family there. And a pretty nice deal. They would give me an evening meal every evening, and I had the attic more or less to myself as a self-contained place to live. Funny thing was, first night I stayed there, went to sleep, and suddenly about 5 in the morning, holy hell is breaking loose outside. I'm hearing this squealing at really high volume, and that's when I realized that the house I was living in was right next to the periodic livestock market in Bury St. Edmunds. And what was happening is they were offloading pigs for sale on the market, and the pigs were going nuts, basically. So 2 days a week I had this wake-up call from the livestock market at Bury. And the market there, they also had just a general market on market days, and I think it was actually Wednesdays and Saturdays in Bury, exists down to the present day, where you have all these merchants set up little shops and booths in the middle of town in this designated area at designated hours, and it operates during that time. On market days, I'd always head into the town, actually, because there was this guy who had this little donut shop that was on wheels that he would drag in behind his car. And he made the best damn donuts in the world. And so I would go there and get donuts a couple of days a week whenever the market was in town. And so this is a phenomenon that begins earlier than the towns. It continues alongside and within the towns and continues down to the present day in a lot of towns in England. You'll see it being set up. The fair was a little bit different. What distinguishes it from a market? Well, it's a periodic meeting of traders, usually for a set number of days or weeks. and it's not more frequent than maybe twice a year. So this is a much bigger thing that meets at a specific place, and it's a merchant magnet where a lot of people come together to exchange goods. At fairs, merchants could count upon meeting other merchants and acquiring desired commodities and selling whatever they had with them. What distinguished these fairs from normal markets is that they dealt principally with commodities of distant origin. This is where you would see products being brought over from Europe, for instance. Spices that had originally started way east came through the integrated systems, eventually arrive in fairs in England. Then merchants could buy them. They could take them into their own towns and sell them in their own towns. And so basically, these were goods of higher value that would support the cost of transporting them over considerable distances. And so what you begin to see emerging between the markets and the fairs and the towns is kind of an integrated trading system that can move all kinds of goods for local needs, for local consumption, but also from more distant needs. And this was basically the final element of high medieval expansion in Britain, the appearance of this integrated system that allows all this trade. But the larger point is that during this period from 1000 to 1300, you see growth in every area, economic, political, social, cultural. And this is the last piece of it, the economic growth, which I sort of held off on. And having said this, this has been a very long lecture. And since my wife mentioned lunch, I realize it's about 12:25. I'm getting very hungry, so I'm going to sign off for now. And as I said, this is probably the longest sort of thing I'm going to do for you, or maybe the second longest. So I would certainly urge you to take this in pieces. And I want to reiterate, in our current circumstances, be safe, be smart, take care of yourself, take care of your friends and family. And I hope within some period of time we'll be out of here. Should also note that Mr. Northam is extending this on into June. So we're going to be living this sort of life for a while, and I guess we all should try to get used to it, keep our spirits up, and go on about our business. More later. Take care. Bye-bye.